Sit down or I'll make you. That's what Officer Granger told a quiet black man reading a book on a park bench. Moments later, that man was in handcuffs, shocked families watching in disbelief. What the officer didn't realize, he had just arrested the newly appointed director of the FBI. This isn't fiction. It's America, where even power and titles can't shield black bodies from prejudice. It reminds us of James Baldwin's haunting truth. To be a Negro in this country and to be relatively conscious is to be in a rage almost all the time. But what happens next will surprise you. Not with vengeance, but with grace. This is a story about justice, redemption, and the kind of strength that doesn't shout, it listens. If this story hits home, don't just watch, talk to us. Drop your thoughts in the comments, like the video if it stirred something in you, and subscribe, because stories like this deserve to be heard, remembered, and passed on. It was supposed to be just another quiet afternoon at Willow Creek Park. The sun hung low in the sky, casting golden light through the tall Georgia pines, and the air was filled with the scent of cut grass and the distant laughter of children. A few families picnicked under the shade, teenagers played basketball on the far court, and in the middle of it all sat a quiet, middle-aged black man on a weathered wooden bench, alone, calm and completely absorbed in the hardcover book resting on his knee. Elias Moore was dressed modestly, a dark gray blazer over a crisp white button-down, slacks pressed just right, and a pair of reading glasses that framed his deep, thoughtful eyes. His salt and pepper hair was neatly cropped, and his polished brown shoes sat flat on the concrete. To any ordinary observer, he looked like a retired professor or maybe a church deacon enjoying his afternoon. But not to Officer Tyler Granger. Granger was a young white cop in his late 20s, fresh out of the academy, buzz-cut, built like a linebacker, and always scanning for what he liked to call preemptive threats. He cruised through the park in his patrol car, bored and hungry for action. That's when he spotted Elias, a lone black man, sitting still, in a family park, not moving much, not smiling, not talking. Granger pulled the car to a slow crawl, narrowed his eyes, then stepped out with his hand already resting near his holster. His boots crunched the gravel as he approached. "Hey there, sir," Granger called, voice clip. "Mind telling me what you're doing here?" Elias looked up from his book, unfazed. "Reading," he replied gently. This bench seemed quiet. Granger's eyes flicked to the book, then back to Elias. "Got any ID on you?" "I do," Elias said, slipping a wallet from his blazer and offering his driver's license without a word. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move suddenly. He knew how quickly things could go wrong. Granger squinted at the ID, then frowned. "Elias Moore, what brings you to this part of town?" Elias gave a half-smile. "I live 6 blocks from here. This is my park, too." But Granger didn't like the tone. Didn't like being challenged without being challenged. Something about Elias's calm composure made him bristle. "I'm going to need you to stand up," he barked. Elias blinked slowly. "Officer, is there a reason you're detaining me?" "Stand up." People began watching. A few kids nearby stopped playing. A young mother pulled her daughter closer on the swing. Elias slowly rose. "There's no need for escalation. I'll be the judge of that," Granger said, and without warning he grabbed Elias's arm, twisted it behind his back, and cuffed him. The metal clink of the handcuffs echoed across the park. "What the hell?" someone shouted from a picnic blanket. A teenager started filming with his phone. The mother gasped. Elias said nothing. He didn't resist. He didn't speak. He just redded his head and breathed slowly through his nose. Granger dragged him toward the cruiser, muttering under his breath, "You think you're better than everyone? Sitting here like you own the place." The door slammed shut behind Elias as the cruiser pulled away, leaving stunned silence behind. One of the children who had smiled at Elias earlier looked up at her mom. "Why did the police take the nice man?" The mother didn't have an answer. Back at the precinct, Granger swaggered in with pride, tossing the cuffs onto the front desk like a trophy. "Got myself a suspicious individual loitering in the park. Didn't answer questions right." The desk sergeant barely looked up. "Name?" Elias Moore. The sergeant froze. Wait, Elias Moore? She repeated. Granger nodded. Smug. She slowly looked up, eyes wide. Are you of your mind? Granger's grin faded. What? You just cuffed the new director of the FBI. Everything went still. The hum of the fluorescent lights seemed louder now. Granger's mouth moved, but no sound came out. And in the holding room, Elias sat quietly, hands folded, eyes closed, waiting. The buzz around the precinct had shifted from casual routine to stunned confusion. Officers glanced at one another, whispering in low tones, eyes flicking toward the holding room. No one dared go inside. Not yet. Not after hearing the name. Not after realizing who was sitting behind that steel door. Tyler Granger stood frozen near the front desk, his hands resting on his utility belt, heart pounding in his ears. That can't be right, he mumbled. No way, that's him. But Sergeant Dana Keller didn't look amused. She pushed a few keys on her computer, pulled up a high-security government file, and turned the monitor so Granger could see. There it was, Elias Moore, recently confirmed as the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The president himself had shaken his hand on national television just 2 weeks ago, and now, that same man was sitting in a holding cell booked for loitering. Granger's mouth went dry. Keller's voice dropped to a cold whisper. Do you have any idea what you've just done? Granger tried to steady his breath. He didn't identify himself. He didn't have to. You had his ID. You had his name. And you still cuffed him in a public park in front of kids? He was acting weird, just sitting there. Keller narrowed her eyes. Since when is reading a book a crime? Down the hallway, Lieutenant Carla Jennings stormed through the double doors. Her heels clicked sharply on the linoleum floor, her expression a storm of fury and disbelief. She was a seasoned officer, a black woman who had fought tooth and nail for every stripe on her shoulder, and she had one rule: don't embarrass this badge. Where is he? She demanded. Granger stepped back instinctively. Holding room 2. Keller answered. Jennings didn't waste a second. She marched down the corridor, flung the door open, and found Elias seated calmly at the metal table. He looked up and gave a slight nod, as if they'd arranged this meeting on purpose. Director Moore, Jennings said, a note of apology in her voice. Elias offered a soft smile. Carla, it's been a long time. Granger's jaw nearly hit the floor from the hallway. They knew each other. Jennings sat across from Elias and exhaled. Sir, no need. Elias interrupted. I'm not angry, just disappointed, but not surprised. She lowered her gaze. You always said the system was broken, Elias continued. Now I've seen it from the other side. Again. Back outside the room, a small crowd of officers had gathered, pretending to check files or pour coffee while trying to listen in. Granger stood still, humiliated, his entire worldview cracking beneath his feet. A few minutes later, Jennings exited the room and walked straight up to him. You will report to Internal Affairs at 0700. You're being placed on administrative leave effective immediately. What? Granger stammered. But you don't argue, you don't justify, you listen. He looked around, but no one came to his defense. Not one officer, not one word of support. Jennings wasn't done. She stepped closer. You didn't just embarrass this department, you embarrassed every one of us who wears this uniform with pride. As she turned to leave, Granger muttered under his breath. So he gets special treatment because he's important? Jennings wheeled around. No, he gets dignity because he's human. That's the part you missed. Granger was left standing in the middle of the room, surrounded by silence. Back inside, holding room 2, Elias removed his glasses, rubbed the bridge of his nose and whispered to himself, same playbook, different decade. But then he looked up, a quiet resolve in his eyes. He didn't believe in revenge. He believed in reform. And this moment would become the first domino in a plan he had been shaping for years. One that didn't just punish one officer, but rewrote the entire training doctrine. One that changed the question from what did you see to what did you assume? And Elias Moore had every intention of making sure no one ever asked that question in silence again. The media found out within hours. By morning, every major news outlet had Elias Moore's name plastered across their screens. FBI director detained by local police officer in Georgia Park, read one chyron. Another shouted national outrage. Black FBI director wrongfully arrested. The headlines hit hard, and they hit fast. Cable networks rolled coverage 24/7. Commentators raged. Social media erupted. Hashtags like Justice for Moore and Profiling Power trended nationwide. But Elias Moore wasn't speaking. Not yet. While reporters camped outside the precinct and drones hovered over the parking lot, Elias sat in a secure conference room within the FBI's regional field office in Atlanta. He was no longer in cuffs, no longer under anyone's control, and yet he remained quiet, calm, focused. Opposite him sat two individuals, Deputy Attorney General Rachel Lynn and Special Counsel Robert Whitaker. Both had flown in from Washington the moment the footage hit CNN. Director Moore, Lynn began carefully, "We're here to ensure this situation is handled appropriately, both legally and publicly." Elias steepled his fingers, his voice level. "This isn't just about me. It's about what happened and why it keeps happening." Whitaker leaned in. "We can issue a federal investigation. The officer will be reprimanded. We can even recommend termination." Elias shook his head. "That's not enough. Firing one man doesn't fix a culture." Lynn tilted her head. "Then what are you suggesting?" "I want to speak," Elias said. "Not just to the press, to the nation." That afternoon, Elias walked onto the stage of the FBI's Atlanta field office auditorium. The podium stood alone beneath the seal of the United States. The press had been waiting. Cameras clicked. Flashes burst. But when Elias stepped into the spotlight, everything went silent. He adjusted the microphone. "My name is Elias Moore. I am the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and yesterday I was arrested for reading a book on a park bench." He paused, letting the weight of those words settle into every ear in the room. "I wasn't loitering. I wasn't disturbing the peace. I wasn't armed. I was simply there. And for that, I was treated like a threat." A murmur rippled through the audience. "This is not the first time something like this has happened," Elias continued, "but I intend to make sure it is the last time it goes unaddressed." The room hung on his every syllable. "I am not here to vilify one officer. I am here to challenge a system that empowers suspicion over understanding, that trains fear instead of discernment, that rewards instinct over evidence." He glanced at the cameras. "I will be launching a national reform initiative within federal law enforcement training programs, mandatory bias recognition, civilian empathy training, community immersion, every agent, every officer, every rank, starting now." Cameras flashed wildly, reporters scribbled like mad. And then came the moment everyone waited for. "I've declined to press charges against Officer Tyler Granger," Elias said, pausing again, "because I believe redemption is more powerful than revenge." Gasps rang out. Journalists exchanged shocked glances. "He will be enrolled in the first round of training, not as punishment, but as proof that we can do better. All of us." The crowd erupted into applause. Back at the precinct, Tyler Granger watched the press conference on a tiny wall-mounted TV in the break room. He sat alone, still in uniform, his badge resting heavy on the table beside him. As Elias spoke, something shifted in his expression. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't defensive. He looked ashamed. After the broadcast, Elias stepped off the stage and was immediately swarmed by reporters. But he raised a hand, not to silence them, but to steady the moment. "There's one more thing," he said. "This isn't just about law enforcement. It's about how we see each other and how we choose to change." That night, millions of Americans saw more than just a man in a suit. They saw grace where there could have been rage. They saw leadership where others would have chosen destruction. And most of all, they saw that true power isn't how loud you shout. It's how deeply you're heard when you whisper truth. The Senate hearing room was packed, wall to wall, with cameras, politicians, civil rights leaders, and a live national audience. It wasn't just another routine session on policing policy. This was the day the FBI director would speak. Not about crime statistics or border security, but about being racially profiled, about being handcuffed in his own country for the crime of existing while black. As Elias Moore entered the chamber, every conversation stopped. He wore a sharp navy blue suit, a small American flag pin on his lapel, and a face carved from years of measured resolve. He didn't look angry. He looked ready. Director Moore, Senator Hayworth, a senior member of the Judiciary Committee, began, "We're aware of the incident that took place in Georgia last week. Would you like to make an opening statement?" Elias adjusted the microphone and leaned forward. "I don't speak today as a victim," he said. "I speak as a mirror." A hushed stillness fell over the room. "A mirror," he repeated, "to reflect the truth we've tried to avoid, that despite rank, status, or title, there are still those of us who are treated with suspicion before a single is spoken." He let the silence stretch. Every eye stayed locked on him. "I was arrested while reading a book in a park. My ID was visible. My demeanor was respectful. I did nothing that warranted fear, and yet I was deemed dangerous by a man with a badge and unchecked assumptions." Senator Martinez leaned forward. "Director, are you implying that systemic racism exists even within federal law enforcement?" "I'm not implying it," Elias replied. "I'm stating it." The room stirred. Senator Conway, clearly uncomfortable, tried to pivot. "But surely, Director, you don't believe this one incident reflects the values of law enforcement across the country?" "No, Senator," Elias said calmly. "This one incident reflects thousands that go unrecorded." The tension in the room thickened. Elias continued without blinking. "We have good officers, great ones, even, but good people operating within a flawed system still produce injustice. We don't just need better individuals, we need a better culture." That was the turning point. From the back row, Reverend Calvin Browning, a civil rights icon, nodded slowly. On Twitter, hashtags exploded again. On C-SPAN, millions of viewers leaned in. Elias didn't stop. "That's why I'm proposing a national certification standard for all federal and local officers. No more voluntary sensitivity classes. No more check-the-box training. This will be mandatory, rigid, and repeatable." Senator Hayworth raised a brow. "And what about Officer Granger?" Elias paused. "Officer Granger is in training. He's attending our pilot program, where he'll face the very biases that blinded him, and I'll be meeting with him next week. Personally." Gasps whispered through the chamber. "You're willing to meet with the man who humiliated you?" a reporter shouted from the side. "I'm willing to meet with the man who represents every officer on the edge of growth," Elias replied. "Accountability without grace is just punishment. I want transformation." Climax struck like thunder. By the end of his testimony, Elias wasn't just seen as a man with authority, he was seen as a man with moral clarity. The committee members were quiet, contemplative, some visibly shaken. The hearing adjourned not with conflict, but with contemplation. Later that week, Elias entered a quiet training facility outside D.C., where Granger had begun his first week in the Reformed Bias training program. Dressed in plain clothes, Elias walked into the room, where a dozen officers sat nervously. Granger stood when he saw him. Their eyes met. "I didn't expect you to come," Granger said softly. "I promised I would," Elias replied. "This isn't about you proving anything to me. It's about you proving something to yourself." Granger nodded, voice cracking. "I never saw you. Not really." Elias placed a hand on the chair beside him. "Then let's start with that." And they sat, not as enemies, but as the beginning of something this country hadn't seen in a long time, healing that came not through rage, but through responsibility. And maybe, just maybe, through redemption. It started with a letter from a child. It arrived at Elias Moore's desk one Monday morning, addressed in blue crayon on a plain white envelope. No return address, just two words written in careful, uneven handwriting, "Thank you." Inside was a folded sheet of notebook paper, with a message from a young girl named Layla, who had been at the park the day he was arrested. She wrote about how confused and scared she felt when she saw the police handcuff the nice man with glasses who had read stories to her and her friends. But then she wrote about seeing him on TV, hearing his speech, and watching him forgive the officer. "My mom says you're a hero," she wrote. "I think you're a superhero, but not the kind that punches, the kind that makes things better." Elias sat back in his chair, the letter trembling slightly in his hand. It wasn't the applause at the Senate, it wasn't the headlines, it was this letter, a child's clarity that reminded him why he chose the harder path. Word of his reform initiative had rippled across the country. Over 24 state and local law enforcement agencies voluntarily signed up for the FBI's new National Bias and Community Empathy program. Departments in cities like Chicago, Baltimore, and Dallas began restructuring their officer evaluations to include community feedback. Recruit training manuals were rewritten, workshops were added, and perhaps most critically, for the first time in history, law enforcement officers were required to complete quarterly civilian immersion sessions in the very neighborhoods they patrolled. But with change came resistance. Some unions pushed back. Talk radio hosts called Elias soft. Critics said he was weakening the badge. Still, Elias pressed forward. He visited precincts in person, sat with young cadets, met with veterans who were skeptical but willing. He told them what he believed over and over again. True strength is not in control, it's in understanding. Meanwhile, Tyler Granger had completed his 12-week program. He was no longer the man who threw handcuffs on someone for reading in a park. He had taken the courses seriously, sometimes painfully so. He'd listened to victims, watched hours of body cam footage, written essays about bias and unconscious fear. He had even volunteered at the local Boys and Girls Club for an extra 4 weeks without pay. One rainy Thursday morning, Granger requested a meeting with Elias. They sat in a small break room at the DC Training Center. No cameras, no ceremony, just 2 men and 2 cups of coffee. "I used to think respect was something you demanded," Granger said, staring into his mug. "Now I know it's something you earn, and something you owe." Elias nodded slowly. "Growth isn't linear, Tyler, but it begins the moment you admit you didn't know everything." Granger looked up, his voice quiet. "What happens next for me?" "That's up to you," Elias replied. "But wherever you go, don't forget where you started, or who helped you stop." That evening, Elias returned to Willow Creek Park for the first time since his arrest. The air was warm, the light golden. Families sat on blankets, kids raced up the jungle gym, and laughter filled the space where shame had once lingered. He found the same wooden bench and sat down. The same trees rustled overhead. The same breeze tugged at his jacket, but something felt different now. A small group of children noticed him and waved shyly. One of them was Layla. "Will you read to us again?" she asked. Elias smiled and pulled a thin, dog-eared book from his bag. "Only if you promise to listen carefully." They gathered around him, sitting cross-legged in the grass, faces eager, eyes wide. As he began to read, parents glanced over and smiled. Nearby, a police cruiser rolled by, slowed, then kept going. No questions, no suspicion, just peace. Elias Moore didn't change the world with a speech or a law. He changed it by refusing to let hate dictate his response, by choosing patience when he had every right to explode, by demanding more from a system while offering it a path to redemption. And somewhere in America, a child now grows up believing a superhero doesn't always wear a cape. Sometimes he wears glasses and carries a book. In a world that often rewards outrage and punishment, Elias Moore chose empathy and transformation, and that's the lesson we can carry into our own lives. As Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "We must learn to live together as brothers or perish together as fools." Change doesn't always come with a protest or a gavel. It sometimes begins with listening, with a quiet refusal to hate, with courage disguised as restraint. Like Elias, we all have moments where we're judged, dismissed, or misunderstood. But what defines us is not how loud we scream back, it's how deeply we understand our power to break the cycle. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you think, don't just scroll past. Leave a comment, share your thoughts. I read every single one. Like this video if it resonated. And if you believe in stories that heal, not just expose, subscribe. You're part of this journey now.